Welcome to Comparing Hot JavaScript Frameworks. Today we're going to talk about Angular, Ember, and React. My name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana without electricity and without running water for 16 years. I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and yes, it was uphill both ways. Little beknownst to me, I found out later when I was an adult that it was the highest, densest population of mountain lions during our walk to school every morning. So luckily we never really saw any, but they were there. I have a middle child known as my 66 21 window bus. I've been working on it. I bought it the same month that Spring 1.0 came out. So I've been working on it for quite some time. It's not done yet. It'll be done in a few more months. I've been saying that at most conference talks I've done those whole 11 years. To fill the gap, I was tired of waiting to have it done, so I bought another bus, a Volkswagen van. If you're into Volkswagens, come talk to me. I love them. Today, I would like to learn a bit more about you. How long have you been programming in JavaScript? Raise your hand if it's longer than 20 years. 2 of us. If it's longer than 10. Okay, that's a good portion. Longer than 5. Only 1 year. I got a few. Okay. Who remembers IE6? We got a good half the room. Netscape 4? We got a bunch there too. Cool. Are you a Java developer? Okay, that's like 90%. Web developer? Okay, it's 80. Are you a programmer? Okay. Who's an Edge developer? That's Microsoft's new thing, right? Their new browser? No one yet? Is anyone using, for your primary development, who uses Firefox? Okay, it's about 10%. Chrome? Everyone. Safari? Nobody, one guy. Do you also do iOS development? No? Who uses React? One guy. 2 guys. Ember? 3. Angular? Everyone else. Who doesn't use any of these yet? Okay, so we got a good 20%. Who thinks that Angular might be the struts of JavaScript Nation? 5. Yeah, it's possible. So what I'm going to try to answer today is, where's the Spring MVC in all of this? Will Angular 2 really succeed? Or React or Ember, the Spring MVC of this contest? And where's like Tapestry and JSF? Where's the component frameworks? Where's EXT.js? Is that it? We're trying to answer what's the best framework in JavaScript land. Is that what you want to learn today? Yes? Okay. We're going to try to make that happen. The last time I looked at web frameworks was February 2014. So in internet land, that's quite some time ago, but it doesn't seem that long ago. It's right, a year and a half ago. In early 2013, we saw the death of Flash and Flex. Steve Jobs came out and said this isn't going to work on an iPad, and that caused a lot of controversy. HTML5 started to really blossom. Mobile became huge, and many frameworks started to mature. The last 5 years look a lot different. We began with the iPad 5 years ago, and we've had a lot of CSS and JavaScript frameworks crop up, and the Java frameworks have kind of not kept up as much. So are there too many web frameworks? This was an interesting slide from way back then, a whole year and a half ago, and most people would say, yes, there's way too many Java web frameworks. And they used to make fun of us in Java land because we had so many web frameworks. Look at the JavaScript guys now. So many web frameworks. It's now the most popular language. But you know what? There's too many gene choices, right? There's too many car choices, right? There's choices all the time, and they're all constrained. There's too many vacations options, right? They're constrained by something. You don't go on vacation to Bora Bora because you can't afford it. You don't buy the new Tesla even though you really want it because you can't afford it. Jeans, you don't buy them because they're not in fashion anymore. And this same sort of stuff happens with web frameworks. I don't know if you remember SOFEA. That was introduced in 2007. Service-oriented front-end architecture. They basically said you should put the MVC on the client instead of on the server like we were doing. Well, that became a reality, and largely because of HTML5 and technologies like PhoneGap kind of came along and said, you can develop with these tools and make them, just as good, if not a lot better than the old way of doing things, which was, server-side rendering of pages. Interestingly enough, in 2012 and 2013, we came out with some things from Twitter, from Airbnb, and from this guy who's been doing a lot of work with client-side MVC, and they basically said, this whole client-side rendering and templating is not the answer. It's still slow, or it's too slow, and we should do server-side rendering. So at the time, this is February 2014, my synopsis was, traditional web frameworks are still relevant. Who agrees with that? Okay, we have about 10 people. I don't think so. I take that back, a year and a half later. Server-side rendering is still relevant. Traditional web frameworks, not so much. In case you didn't hear me, I had to bold and underline that. So The Paradox of Choice, great book. It talks about autonomy and freedom of choice are critical to our well-being. And choice is critical to freedom and autonomy. Nonetheless, though modern Americans have more choice and freedom than we ever have had, the happiest moment in our time, they've discovered, was 1960s, when the choice was not there. Now that we're overcome with choice, they've seen the happiness of most people go down, not up, because of the paradox of choice, because there's so many choices. Choices haven't gotten any easier, right? It's still hard to pick out jeans, still hard to pick out what potato chips you like. If you live in Colorado, the beer selection is wonderful. So you always stand there, and it takes a while to figure out what you want. So how do you deal with that? There's a consumer strategy for most good decisions. They involve these steps, figuring out your goals, evaluate the importance of each goal, array the options, pick the winning one, and evaluate them. So we do this every day with various things we buy or various things we do. And they've come up with, there's two types of people. There's a chooser versus a picker. A chooser thinks about all the possibilities. If they can decide none, they might create their own, right? You see this with web frameworks all the time. We got some choosers there. A picker just grabs, the thing that looks like it might be the best option and hopes for the best. And basically the proliferation of choices robs us of the opportunity to decide for ourselves just how important a decision is. And so if you see and accept only the best, you become a maximizer. So these are the people that develop their own frameworks or really, really want to know what the best one is. Maybe they've had a lot of luck with AngularJS, but they keep hearing about React, and so they're like, man, should we be using React instead? Even though I can actually create these applications wicked fast, and they look good, my clients are happy, or my boss is happy, should I be using something else? If you find yourself in that realm of thinking, then you're probably a maximizer. A Satisficer is basically the first suitable choice, right? Good enough. If you're doing agile development, this is how you're supposed to think. But a lot of people, typically might be more of a, this needs to be the best, or it needs to be perfect before it ships. But agile tends to promote, try to just make it good enough. So if you think the easiest way to choose a web framework is to narrow the number of choices down, that's how I usually do it. If we have 100, then how are we going to get to 3, right? How are we going to get to 5? And what I saw when I was comparing Java web frameworks was in the initial one, I had like Struts and Spring MVC, I think, and Tapestry, and I kept getting people asking me to add their framework, right? Can you add ice faces? I had companies sending me emails, not quite bribing or willing to pay, but sending me emails with attachments of pages of why I should add their framework to the list. And that's not really the goal when you're evaluating frameworks. You don't want me to sit up here and talk about the 100 that we have to choose from. You want me to talk about the best ones or the most popular ones. So if you can narrow it down, that's usually the easiest way to choose, a web framework. The beauty in this talk, there's only 3 choices. So we're not doing all the JavaScript web frameworks. We're just talking about 3. So one of the real problems, and I talked about this 2 years ago, is they're all pretty awesome. It's like choosing between a Ferrari and a Lamborghini and a Bugatti, right? I'll take all 3. Anyone, you don't even have to tell me, just give me one, that'd be great. So when I started doing this talk, I realized I hadn't used React or Ember in production. Their hype machines are really good. You hear about them a lot, right, and why you should be using them. But I want to know about the developer experience. How do you do things? Do you use ngRoute? Do you use gulp? Do they require specific build tools? Does browser sync provide the magic, or is it the web framework that provides the magic? So I said, okay, well, let's look back at how I chose in the past. 2006, I said, based on the type of app you're developing. 2010, I had this matrix that was great for controversy because I stuck a bunch of little zeros and ones and 0.5s in a box, and people said, wow, that helps. 2013, I narrowed it to just 6 criteria. 2015, my thinking has changed. Why would you limit your choices? I think it's important to learn as much as you can every day. I think as developers, one of the problems we have is once we learn something, especially I see this with myself as a Java developer and other Java developers, is they don't really want to learn something new. So you look at Node as a threat, or you look at something new as a threat. And I think you need to keep that open mind that you had when you were younger, and you just wanted to learn. You just wanted to try something new. It's learning is like loving running, skiing, mountain biking, playing guitar. The more you do, the better you'll get at it. So practice. Practice a lot. One recommendation I have is Josh Long's What's New in Spring every Tuesday. That guy's been doing that for 5 years, every Tuesday. Never misses it. So great way to figure out what's going on in Spring community. So why should you care? Why should you care about these JavaScript web frameworks? Because SEO is happening. SEO was the biggest barrier for people to use these client-side frameworks to render their UIs. Now, if you're doing something like Wikipedia, maybe you don't want to use a JavaScript MVC framework, but for apps, the things that we're building, the things that we're putting on phones, it does make a lot of sense. So these guys did searchengineland.com, so obviously they're a little biased, right? But they tested how Googlebot crawls JavaScript, and they learned that it's able to execute an index with a multitude of implementations. Confirmed Google is able to render the entire page and read the DOM, thereby indexing dynamically generated content. SEO signals in the DOM are respected, and this is basically May of this year. So not just Google saying we support JavaScript now, but these guys ran extensive tests and said, yeah, they're pretty much doing it. So you can, if you're worried about SEO, actually write your JavaScript applications, have those rendered dynamically, and it will index them. So a lot has changed since 2010. Bootstrap was a huge boon to the web developer community. They basically gave us a way of having iOS development style of development where someone else said, here's how things should look if you follow this style and if you mark up your HTML this way. There was also an explosion of these JavaScript web frameworks, and they've been out there, right? There's been Backbone for a while, but the ones that really started coming out and emerging were AngularJS, Ember, and React. So these are the ones that have been mainly on my radar, and I do think I have a unique ability to judge good web frameworks and pick if they'll succeed or not. I've been doing AngularJS development for over 2.5 years. I still love it, but I wanted to know more about the competition. And if you know my background, I started comparing Java web frameworks back in 2004. The first talk I ever did at any conference was ApacheCon in Las Vegas, and it was about struts versus Spring MVC versus Tapestry. And when I started, I was a huge struts guy, mostly because it was better than servlets, and it worked pretty well. And what I found was that as I learned about these other frameworks, it opened my eyes. And so I'm in a similar situation, or I was a couple weeks ago, where I was like, I want to learn about these other frameworks. I want to see if they're as good as the hype is. Do they have the same development experience? An interesting thing about calling yourself an AngularJS developer, and that's why I asked the question earlier about, are you a Java programmer, or are you a web developer, or are you a programmer, is because we often identify ourselves with the frameworks we know. But we don't do that with Spring, right? We don't say we're a Spring developer. You don't go to the lady at the DMV and say, I'm a Hibernate developer, right? You say, I'm a programmer. So I think that's something to consider when you're talking to your peers is try not to identify yourself with a framework, more of web developer. I think it's great that Tim Berners-Lee, when he was interviewed a few years ago, his title on CNN was web developer. Right? He's the guy who invented the internet. Or that was Al Gore. www, he invented that. So I think it's important to stand on the shoulders of giants, to look at what others are doing. People have used my presentations before. They've referenced them. They've talked about them in books. That's a great thing about open source. So what I decided to do for this talk, instead of me coming up with a matrix or me coming up with the criteria, I chose someone else's. Yevgeniy Brikman is a former software engineer from LinkedIn, and he did this great talk about how you can compare web frameworks. And what he did is used a framework scorecard. He's also written this book now called hello-startup.net. If you're into a startup, you might want to read this. It's a pretty good book. I just watched his talk. He had a talk on YouTube for an hour and a half, and it was great. It's about the people more so than what you're building and stuff like that. So I recommend that. Anyway, he did this talk about node versus play, and in it he compared a number of different criteria. He started with learning and developing and testing, securing, building, deploying, debugging, scaling, maintaining, and sharing. So he took all those different criteria and said, let's give each framework a score. For each feature, he wanted to discuss whether it was worse than most frameworks, and it got a really low score, a 1. About the same as most frameworks, give it a 5. Better than most frameworks, give it a 10. So before we start ranking each of these frameworks, we're going to go through and give them scores. I want to talk a bit about the history of each one, because they do have interesting histories. So AngularJS, I learned about this from an episode of Breaking Open on LinkedIn. It was kind of like a podcast, kind of like an interview. It was started by Miško Hevery, 2009. And so what he says, February 20th, 2010, basically he was working on a team that had GWT, and they had developed it with 3 other developers for 6 months. And so he'd been working on this side project, which was Angular, and he convinced his boss, can I actually rewrite everything with Angular? And at the time, there wasn't any JavaScript. This was basically an HTML framework, and you'd use directives and everything like Angular has, and it would render the client. He said, it'll take me 2 weeks. And his boss was like, well, we've got 6 months times 3 developers, 18 man-months into this. Go ahead, good luck. He did it in 3 weeks. So it took him a little bit longer. Obviously, he had all that domain knowledge, right, of learning it. And so he was able to do it quickly. You can learn more on YouTube at that URL. And so this was the story of Angular, right? It was this guy that worked at Google. He had this side project and had written, this application in it. Does anyone know the real story? So that's been the story out there, right? That's what I've been talking about. That's what the news says. So I did a bit of digging into it, and I found out it was originally developed in 2009 at his company called Brat Tech LLC, and they were it was the software they were using for an online JSON storage service. So basically, it was its own startup at one point. It wasn't like he was some guy at Google working there. He had developed this thing at a company. They had a website. They had an open source project, and the founders were acqui-hired by Google, right? So Google hired them, for their talent. So fascinating, because I thought he was just some guy working there, but it had already done that. Ember has a bit more rich history. In December 2011, it was Sprout Core, which was owned by Apple at one point. It was renamed to Ember.js. Sprout Core was initially created in 2007 by Sprout It. June 2010, the creator of Sprout Core, Charles Jolly, left Apple to start this company called Strobe, and Strobe was acquired by Facebook November 2011. Right? So Ember could have been React in a sense. But the framework was created by Yehada Katz, a member of the jQuery, Ruby on Rails, and Sprout Core team, so he's on all those. In December 2011, it was renamed to Ember.js. That's what Yehada looks like. And like many of his other projects, jQuery and Ruby on Rails, convention over configuration, that's their biggest thing. And they've succeeded. The biggest difference between this and React and Angular is it's not backed by a big company. Right? You have Facebook, you have Google. This is very much more community driven. They have big customers using it. Yahoo, Apple, LinkedIn, and Bustle are all major users. And Apple Music is written with Ember. So they do have large sites using it and large customers. React has a little shorter history. It was created by Jordan Walk, and maybe there's a similar story here where he worked at a startup and they had a framework that was acqui-hired. But this was all I could find about it. Here's what he looks like on Twitter. It was inspired by XHP, an HTML components framework for PHP. It was open sourced in May 2013, so about 2.5 years ago. And within 1 year, it had some large sites using it, more so than the other frameworks. Khan Academy, New York Times, Airbnb, and those really big ones, Facebook and Instagram. So they've had the ability to basically real-world use huge sites really quickly. So it's interesting if you look at this timeline. I apologize that it's blurry up here on my Retina display. It looks fabulous. A little blurry up there, though. So Angular, 2 years it took from when it was first announced to when it was open sourced, or when it was open sourced to when it was 1.0. Since then, 2.0 is coming. It's in alpha right now. Beta hasn't been announced. But 4 years, it's quite some time from 1.0 to 2.0. Ember took about 1.5 years from when it was announced to 1.0. 3 years for 2.0. They just announced it last month. So, pretty good job there. React, they don't even have 1.0 yet. They're at like 0.14. Right? So who knows if they'll ever get to 1.0. But if you look at Node, right? Node was like 0.12 and now it's 4.0. Right? So maybe React will do something similar. Let's get back to the scorecard. When I talk about learning in this context, I'm talking about initial learning curve. How long does it take to get it? Right? How long until you're able to actually write some code with it and be like, I've learned this new framework, it's pretty cool, it's great for what I'm doing at work. With Angular, Hello World isn't too difficult. This is right on their homepage. 14 lines of code. And you can wire up a backend with Firebase and have an app in 10 minutes. Their homepage is all about learning. Notice they have a Learn menu way up at the top here. Is my laser working? Kinda. And then they have design docs. They have this Learn in your browser for free. They put a pretty good emphasis on learning. And there's even in-page tutorials on that homepage. If you scroll down on the right, there's things that you can modify and actually see things change. So that's pretty neat. I like their link to Learn Angular in your browser. That links to a free course at Code School. So you can go and take this, and it's got a number of steps, and you can get badges. We all like to get badges these days, and a nice way to learn. There's also a PhoneCat tutorial. This is how I first learned Angular, was going through this tutorial and learning how to build this list of phones and be able to search through those phones. And that's right under the Learn menu where you can see their tutorial. And then if you look at case studies, they have builtwith.angularjs.org. A bunch of different sites that use it. They've been built with it. You can learn about how other companies have used it. And this is what happens a lot in enterprises is you come up with this new framework and your boss or your manager says, well, who's using it, right? And so you have to be able to say, well, Google's using it or so-and-so's using it. So this is a nice way to do that, built with .angularjs.org. And Angular Seed. It's a starter app that you download from GitHub, and you're able to basically start developing, with this in their build system and start creating. And Angular 2, right? This is an alpha, maybe beta soon, but they have this learn in 5 minutes. So again, focusing on the learning. And Angular 2 is a bit harder for the JavaScript developer because it uses TypeScript. So if you don't know TypeScript, then you'll have to learn it. You don't have to, but they encourage you to. Their API docs are pretty good. I use them a lot. I just search for the resource or a particular service I'm using, and I can find that easily. There's a lot of videos. Under that Learn menu, there's a videos section, so they know that video learning is important to people, and they also have their own YouTube channel. You would expect them to. They are Google. And there's also egghead.io. They have 247 lessons in bite-sized chunks. And when I mean bite-sized, I mean like 2 to 3 minutes. So if you want to learn how to write a directive, it's a great way to learn quickly. Basics are free, otherwise it's $20 a month. So they're going to try to hook you. And even to watch one video, they're going to make you sign up with an email. But then they do send you emails that you actually get and you appreciate because they are things that you want to learn. I haven't signed up for any sort of monthly package, but I did use them a lot when I was first learning Angular. If you search YouTube for AngularJS, no spaces, no dots, 98,000 videos. A lot of people are talking about Angular. Amazon returns 322 results for AngularJS books. So we have Unraveling AngularJS 1.4, Pro AngularJS, Professional AngularJS. The Pack Publishing guys have a couple. And so, these are all out there, and they've ranked pretty well. Their, reviews from people are 4s or higher. So they're all, these are only books that are 4s or higher. I didn't take any 3s and put them on here. These are all, the ones that people like. The one I personally like is NG Book. I bought it, and these guys are doing a great job of not only keeping that book updated, but writing one for Angular 2. So the book and the source code, $39. You can also get videos for $79, or you can have your whole team use it for $2.99. And they do keep it up to date. So that's a nice book. Like I said, they're doing one for Angular 2. On Stack Overflow, 118,000 questions. A lot of people look at that and say, well, that's because there's a lot of problems. No, I've been looking at this stuff for 10 years, and the popular ones have a lot of questions. And the less popular ones don't. Stack Overflow is the lead developer on my team. So it's nice to have him around. So I give Angular a 10 on their learning resources. I do think when Angular 2 comes out, or when it's released as not beta and people are using it in production, this could drop to an 8 because Struts saw this and other frameworks have seen this when they do a revision and it's not quite backwards compatible. Tapestry 4 to 5, Tapestry 5 to 6, even though it hasn't happened yet, it might. And so this is one of those things that if you're going to release a non-backwards compatible version, you're going to have a hard time for people learning your framework because there's old stuff versus new stuff. So it could drop, but right now it's a 10. So if we take a look at Ember, their hello world on their website, this getting started guide at that URL, basically doesn't have any code writing. It has a bunch of commands that you run. npm install. For the CLI, you create a new app with their CLI, and then you run a server with their CLI. Requires nodes 0.12 or higher, npm 2.7 or higher, and so it's somewhat intimidating if you're just a JavaScript developer and you haven't used Node or used any of these tools, and you come to their Hello World page because you're like, wow, I thought I was going to write some code. So I actually had to look for a Hello World. It wasn't on their website. And this is what I found, 16 lines of code. They do encourage the use of jQuery. That could be because the founder is also on the jQuery core team. There's 2 files you have to use, an Ember min and then the Ember template compiler. You create an application, and then you can render it in the template. And so down here, this is how they do their templating, is oftentimes inline, where you have this text X handlebars, and then you give it a name. And so it automatically, using convention over configuration, will find that index route for you. And that's one of the things that the other frameworks don't really have. They have, here's how to do routing, but they don't have like, hey, the first one, we got it. So on their homepage, a framework for creating ambitious web applications. Lots of information, but there's not really any learning pointers like there is on the Angular site. So there's, again, some commands for running NPM, but it doesn't say, go watch this video, or go take this tutorial. And so it's not as pointed in that way. And if you look below the fold, below that initial page, there is some simple and complex examples. And if you know JavaScript, they make sense. But if you don't know JavaScript and you're just getting started, it's a little intimidating at first. There is a free Code School course, similar to AngularJS, but only the first level is free. So with AngularJS, the whole course is free. With Ember, they're trying to just get you hooked on the first one, and then you'll pay for the other ones. The API docs, they have pretty good docs. There's lots of information there. They have guides, which is a great community contribution. So a lot of people are contributing, and there's a lot of people working on the library as well as using it. On egghead.io, there's no lessons. So those guys in particular have said, hey, there's not as much of a market here. We're going to kind of ignore that. The two things they do have are pretty good, emberscreencast.com and emberwatch.com. And you can tell these JavaScript frameworks are way more popular and have way more funding than any of the Java MVC frameworks ever did. We never had a dedicated screen site, right, for screencasts. Spring MVC screencast.com, no way. Struts screencast, didn't happen. So Ember screencasts actually cost money, $10 a month. Could be worth it. I mean, you make $10 pretty quickly as a developer. If you YouTube for Ember.js, this is the most popular term that I found, 9,300 videos, so still quite a few out there. Ember Watch shows 12 books, so not as many as Amazon. But if you look on Amazon, Amazon has 98 results for Ember.js and books. The problem is Ember.js in action is one of the highest ranked, and it's got 3 stars. So even though there's books, doesn't mean they're good. Mastering Ember is the only 4-star book. So they do have a lot of books out there, they just aren't being well written maybe. Single web page applications, like all the other ones that came up besides these ones, were actually more about building full applications, not specifically Ember. Single web page web applications was the only one that was above 4. So all the rest were like 4 and below. Like I said, that Mastering Ember is only 4.1. Everything else is like a 3. There's also Ember CLI 101, which is a lean pub book. It's not shown on Amazon. Kind of like that NG book, where it's often updated. It's sent out, and you'll get updates if you buy it. Stack Overflow, 16,000 questions, so a lot less than the 110, but a lot more than a lot of frameworks out there. So I give it a 6. And it kind of seems targeted towards Rails developers. A lot of the tutorials out there are basically using Rails as a backend, and what I see with Angular a lot more is just using JavaScript as a backend, right? Node or maybe Firebase or something like that, but these guys are specifically targeting Rails, and I see a lot of their developers being former Rails developers or continue to be Rails developers. So as a Java developer, that's a little weird, but understandable. So if we look at React, their hello world, 18 lines of code. So we've gone up 2 lines for each hello world that I found. Angular started out with 14, Ember is 16, and React is 18. But you can see here there's a lot of ceremony, right? We count the doc type, we count the HTML, the head, the title, all that. And here, it's pretty simple. They use script tags similarly for their templates. You can also load them externally, but this basically takes, and uses raw JavaScript to put that React element into that div ID. And it uses JSX, and this was a big controversy when it first came out. People were like, why are you putting XML in JavaScript? That doesn't seem right. So you don't have to. This is what it looks like when you just create an element and you render a whole world, and if you want to pass in an argument, you can, and you can grab it from the props argument. But you can also write straight up compiled JavaScript. So if you don't want to use that JSX syntax, you don't have to. So what they call it is a JavaScript syntax extension that looks similar to XML. But like I said, you don't have to use it. They think it's more familiar for casual developers, such as designers, so that's why they chose to use it. Has the benefit of balanced open and closing tags, helps make large trees easier to read for function calls. And it doesn't alter the semantics of JavaScript. So that's the reasoning. And if you look at their homepage, it's interesting because they say just the UI is important. Right? They start that on the left in that little box there. And getting started is prominent. They have a big button there. Good component references, a stateful component, simple component, and they have all this below the fold. And a component with external markdown shows you how to render from external markdown. So they do a pretty good job there. Their API docs are really well documented. I like how it starts on a quick start guide. It says basically, download this starter kit, write these commands, and you'll have your first thing up and running. And I think that appeals to web developers more than like you saw with Ember, where it has run these npm commands. Right? It's more of, hey, download this, modify this HTML, and you're good to go. And thinking in React is, well, they have a tutorial that's a great follow-up. So once you've done this getting started guide at the bottom, it says, hey, do this tutorial. And then they also have a thinking in React, because it is different than traditional MVC frameworks with JavaScript. They've said, here's why, and here's how you need to think. So they have this whole section on thinking in React. They have a number of videos that's listed in the docs. So you can see here, right under the left community resources, they have a videos link, and you can see a bunch of conferences presentations. I love conference presentations. That's how I've learned half the stuff I know is like watching parlays or Devox or Java 1 talks, because people condense a lot of information into an hour. So it's a great way to learn about different frameworks. Egghead.io has 101 lessons. So they're on board with React. They don't have as many free ones as Angular does, but they definitely see some value in there. The interesting thing about React is it's not a full-blown MVC framework yet. It's still the V in MVC. So they have a different take on things where they're not trying to be a controller. They're not talking and getting data. In fact, a lot of their examples use jQuery and .ajax to actually make calls and get data. So there's also a free React Fundamentals course on egghead.io, and that's 21 lessons. So there is a fair bit of information there that is free. They have 573 results for React on Amazon. 573. Well, that's what happens when you choose a word like React. Right, it's tough to Google for. So if you add JS, no space, you get 17. And if you do React.js, you get 26. So still, one of those ones that's kind of tough to Google for. Kind of like Tapestry back in the day. You get all these rugs. You're like, I don't want to learn how to make rugs. So React up and running. These are the ones that exist right now. So you can see that they're not from major publishers. Pact Publishing, the last one is. The other one are kind of like homemade or self-published, basically. And then the rest are coming soon. So React Up and Running from O'Reilly is coming out in December, as well as React.js Cookbook. And then Introduction to React is supposed to be released, what's today? 16th? 17th, yesterday. Supposed to be released yesterday, so hot off the press if you want it. On Stack Overflow, only 5,000 questions. A lot less than Ember at 16,000, and Angular at 118. CoffeeScript has 7,800. So CoffeeScript still doing better than React. So they do emphasize learning a fair amount, so I give them an 8 on that. It would be higher, but it lacks books, Stack Overflow questions, and project maturity, basically. Interesting, if you look at the top questions for each one. AngularJS, service versus provider versus factory, right? They have 3 ways to create these services, so-called. So that's the most popular one there with 406,000 views. If you look at Ember, it's separate REST, JSON API server, and client. Talking about Rails, right? Ruby on Rails 3 is the tag in that one. That one has 53,000 views. And then React is all about their concept of a virtual DOM. So those are what people are wondering about with those different frameworks. Kind of interesting. So let's talk about development. With routing in each one, you have RESTful routing with Angular, extracts query and path parameters. You basically use a colon parameter name syntax. It uses ngRoute by default. You do have to add that to your configuration. And there's also this UI router project, which I've used for about 2 years, that's even better than ngRoute and makes routing a lot simpler. It does URLs in your browser, and it does history, and so works really nicely. With Ember, they have RESTful routing as well. They extract your query and path parameters, uses conventions. And so this, they all somewhat use conventions, but you get a few routes for free with Ember. You get application route and you get an index route. Those, if you have those named appropriately, it'll just find them and serve them up right away. So none of the other frameworks serve something up automatically. And interestingly enough, they have nested routes, which is something that Angular has with UI router, and they have wildcards, which aren't out there as much with the other ones. With React, there's no routing. There's only view. They do have this director project that you can use. In the TodoMVC example that I'll talk about their code, they actually use that. And React Router is 2 times more popular than Director, and it was actually inspired by Ember. So the fact that those guys are using tools that were inspired by one of the other frameworks, they even say many thanks to the Ember team, shows that Ember kind of does a really good job in this area. So with Angular and ngRoute, these are all from TodoMVC, and if you Google TodoMVC, you come up with this project where these very ambitious developers have basically implemented a to-do list with JavaScript MVC frameworks. And there's a lot of Java MVC frameworks. So if you're curious how one does it versus another, I encourage you to go look at that site. If you subscribe and watch the site on GitHub, you'll actually get a fair amount of notifications of people updating them, adding new projects. So with Angular, you basically start with your route config, you have your controller, your template, and then you resolve. You can load up data using that resolve method. And then this route provider at the bottom there shows you when you hit this URL, then go to this page. When you hit status, go to this page. With Ember, it looks similar. They have this, they embed. It's a little more JavaScript-y. You can see everything, is encapsulated within that function. And then they, route to their indexes, similar in their controllers. And if you look at React, they have, create class, and then they have this component did mount, and they have this router set up, and it says, for this, go to this page, for this, go to this page. So they all have, similar routing. They all support it. With templates, Angular uses HTML5 templates. You'll write a lot of HTML if you're doing Angular. They have Angular-specific elements and attributes, ng dash. You can use data dash ng, but it's there. Directives, expression language, filters and forms. With Ember, they don't have their own templating language. They have handlebars. So they use handlebars. They have an HTML-like DSL for those. Most of them are defined in script tags. And they have similar concept that Rails does, which is helpers. Right? In Java land, it used to be JSP tags, something similar where you have these helpers that process the logic or whatnot. And with React, it's JSX or straight JavaScript, similar to E4X, namespace components, and JavaScript expressions. And the helpers in Ember are for conditionals, loops, filtering, links, forms, logging. Kind of cool that they have logging, as a helper. And then the templates, this is what they look like in Angular. You have an ng view, you have different ng dash attributes with handlebars. It looks a little different. So you can see there's a bunch of curly braces. You might notice there's no syntax highlighting. And that's because when I tried to copy and paste this as syntax highlighted text, what I got was a bunch of weird characters here and here and here. So this also tells you that not as good a support out of your IDE. This is kind of what Handlebars gives you. I think the Ruby on Rails people don't really care because they're used to using TextMate or Sublime, and Sublime does a pretty good job. But if you use other things like IntelliJ or Eclipse, you might not get as good component or template support. Similar thing with React. This is what a template looks like in React. You can see they have if to-dos length, then go ahead and add some to-dos and give them an on-change event. But still, it doesn't quite grok the syntax highlighting. and then to render a component. That's how you do it. Internationalization. With Angular, it has built-in localization, internationalization for date, numbers, and currencies. They have filters for that. But if you want more than that, you have to use an Angular translate module. And there's a great tutorial on scotch.io that tells you how to do that. So if you're interested in doing internationalization, I recommend looking at that. There's no built-in internationalization in Ember. Surprising to me. But they have this I18N JS module that you can use. There's also Ember, I18N. React, same way, nothing built in for internationalization. But they do have React International, and I stumbled upon that, and I found this format.js, which is actually a pretty good library that has components, mix-ins, relative time, so you can do like 3 minutes from now, and it's got all that built in, and they happen to support Ember as well. So it's not, that bleak for those frameworks. For form binding and validation, there's two-way data binding with ngModel and Angular. There's validation services that are provided, CSS classes for all the different states a component might be in. With Ember, it's one or two-way binding. They have this DS errors, which is their Ember data, and it reports validation errors back. But there's nothing really on the UI that can report validation errors so much. So again, surprising. Internationalization and UI validation aren't quite there. There's Ember validations. There's Ember Easy Form, which are two libraries you can use to have those features, and Ember Forms as well. Form components and events are built into React. They have prop types and dev that you can actually get to, but it's generally agnostic towards your data. It's for rendering and dealing with events, right? It doesn't care as much about your data. But there is a React validation mix-in you can use, and there's Formsy React. So there is, components or plugins out there that you can use. So let's look at the lines of code for each of these. We have these to-do examples out there, and what I like about the to-do examples is someone that's familiar with the language and the libraries went and said, I'm going to create an application, I'm going to do it the way that I think you should do it. So if we look at Angular, it's basically got 12,000 lines of JavaScript. That's a lot. And a little bit of CSS and hardly any HTML. If we look at Ember, 43,000 lines of JavaScript. If we look at React, 24. So if we looked at that in an easy to read way, you can see that Ember has almost twice as much as everyone else just for a simple to-do application. The interesting thing about this is Angular is the only one that has tests. The other ones don't have any tests. There's only 188 lines, but it does have tests. Files, number of files, Angular has 11, Ember has more, React only has 6. So you're able to do less file-wise with React, but code-wise, Angular is the one that wins here. So if we take out the 3 that are tests in Angular, then Angular and Ember, or Angular and React are pretty close. The other thing I Googled for that I thought was interesting was starter kit, right? Angular starter kit, Ember starter kit, React starter kit. 150,000 results for starter kits for Angular. So a lot of starter kit choices. I like Angular Seed. Ember CLI works well for Ember, but they have 77,000, and React has 225,000. So there's a lot of people using these things and putting things out there. I liked what I saw in React Starter.fi. So if you're getting started with React, React Starter.fi has a lot of nice components in there. So the scores I gave to these, I give Angular a 9, I give Ember a 6, and I give React a 5 on the development. React was kind of, because they didn't have the full MVC. So if I weighted all those criteria evenly, I basically took routing, templates, internationalization, forms, and lines of code and put those all as criteria, and I weighted them evenly. And so that's where I came up with these numbers. Routing, React didn't get any points, right? The other two got 2. Templates, everyone got 2. Internationalization, everyone got 1. Forms, I thought Angular was better. Lines of code, I thought Angular was first, and then React was second. Ember was third. But then I realized there's all these add-ons, right? There's all these different libraries we talked about that aren't baked into the framework, but we're so used to using third-party libraries anyway. What's the add-on? So with that, most everyone gets like full 2s, right? For the routing, the templates, internationalization, forms. Lines of code, still the same. So with that, I came up with, well, Angular gets a 10, Ember gets an 8, React gets a 9. But then what I realized was I actually have an experience bias towards Angular. So I'm going to give it a -1. Seems fair. All right, so it ties with React on that level, and Ember's only one below. So with testing, Karma is a JavaScript command line tool that a lot of people use for testing. Jasmine is a behavior-driven development framework. Those are supported with Angular. It has Angular mocks. It has Protractor, which is a wrapper around Selenium. I use that a lot. It's pretty flaky, just like Selenium, but it does work, and it does drive your browser pretty easily. With Ember, they recommend QUnit. They recommend Testum, which is a test runner just like Karma. Use Ember test to run your tests using their command line tool. And they also have acceptance tests, which you can generate using their command line tool. With React, there's a test util, so that's react.addons.testutils. And there's Jest, built on top of Jasmine. And shallow rendering allows you to instantiate a component and get the results of its rendered function. So at that point, you can inspect its type, its props, and Mocha Chai and JS DOM are other ones it recommends. I found it interesting that they all recommended different testing frameworks. So they all have somewhat different philosophies there. So Angular, I gave an 8 because of developer experience bias again. And protractor tests take a while to get right. We're up to like 20 minutes on my project right now, and if one fails, then you got to go inspect it. So it's kind of a pain. React, I gave it an 8 because there's nothing like the protractor or Ember's acceptance tests. So a little bit lower, but otherwise, I would have given Angular a 9, but I wanted to put my developer experience bias in there. So what tool to use to test JavaScript? I thought this was funny. This came out from Ashley Nolan just last week, September 8th. 649 responders, and most people don't use one. 57% of responders are like, yeah, I don't test my JavaScript. So, maybe the JavaScript frameworks or the JavaScript testing tools aren't that important. How many of you that write JavaScript use a testing framework? So it's like 40.14%. No, it's about 10% of the room. So yeah, what I find is a lot of times the workflow is so quickly, especially if you're using something like Browser Sync, that you are testing, but you're just manually testing, and it's so fast that it seems tedious to write the test, but it always does. So let's look at security now. Angular, we have a number of different ways of looking at this: CSRF, cross-site scripting, content, security policy, authorization, then advisories, like are they publishing information about security holes. So those are the few things I looked at. Angular has HTTP and resource. They do look for an XSRF token as a header, and basically when you retrieve that or you retrieve that cookie, Angular will send two tokens back. It'll send an XSRF token and an X-XSRF token header. So they've got that built in. For cross-site scripting, they have a sanitize service and an SCE service. So if you try to put HTML in a component by default, it's not going to work. You actually have to do work to say, hey, this is HTML, render it. Content security policy. If you have one, what this does is it's a header that gets sent out that says you can't use like eval, and you can't use some of the dangerous things in JavaScript. So if you want to have a content security policy with Angular, you do have to tweak some things. So that's why I gave it a little warning sign here. Authorization, they have a number of authorization libraries you can use. Advisories, there isn't any. There isn't a mailing list that you can sign up for and say, who's hacked Angular recently. With Ember, they have a whole security section on their site. So that's great. CSRF, no support. You have to actually do stuff with Rails or whatever API framework you're using. Cross-site scripting, they do have support for that. Content security policy, they do work well with that. There is libraries for doing simple authentication, and there is a mailing list you can sign up for advisories. With React, they have this method named dangerously set inner HTML. So they are trying to warn you, but if you want to set HTML, you can. So there is no CSRF support. That kind of makes sense since they don't do any data transfer, right? They aren't responsible for talking to your backend. They aren't responsible for talking HTTP. They're just rendering the view. Cross-site scripting, nothing in there about that. Content securities policy, you can actually do some stuff to make it work. It requires that you can run the eval command to do cross-site or to do content security policy with React. There is authentication libraries out there, and there is unfortunately no advisories. There is a Node security project. So a lot of these, are available through Node or NPM or Bower, and so Node does believe that's a core value of the Node community. So if you sign up for this, you can see there's a number of advisories. So anything that's published on Node, there will be advisories if there is vulnerabilities found in those libraries. So what I did here is I gave Angular a 7. Could be a 9 if they had the security advisory list, but they don't. I don't know if React deserves a 4 because they don't really do HTTP communication, so I don't know if CSRF applies, but I might change it to a 5. But Ember, I think, is an 8. They do a pretty good job. They're the best of the bunch here. And then I found this mustache security, a wiki dedicated to JavaScript MVC security pitfalls. Unfortunately, you'll notice it's on Google Code, which is not with us anymore, but kind of there. But it's archived, so it's not an active project anymore. But they have all these different criteria, and you can see whether different frameworks pass or fail. So Angular passes, you can see 4 times. Ember has 3 passes, and React, not even on here, is it? Like Reactive. So it's an interesting site. But let's move on to build tools. This was from that same study by Ashley Nolan about task runners you prefer. Gulp is winning the battle there. ngRoute is coming in second, and then Broccoli hardly has any. Most people don't use one, or not most people, but 16%. So again, interesting stats. People, when building Angular, ngRoute, Gulp, Browserify, Webpack, Bower, and NPM. Ember recommends their CLI, and they recommend Broccoli, and they have a whole add-on system with Bower and NPM. React has a starter kit that you download, has React Tools, and React Tools is actually deprecated now as of 9.10. So what's that, just last week or 2 weeks ago? And you can continue to use them, but they recommend migrating to Babel, which has built-in support for React and JSX. So they're all, pretty similar. I give Ember a little higher score here since they have a dedicated tool, right, to run applications, to build tests, to run tests, and React gets a nice because transformation is necessary, right? It's not just raw code. With Angular, it's raw JavaScript. You don't have to transform anything. With TypeScript, you might have to transfer some stuff. So right now, it still gets those. How do you deploy these frameworks? So let's rate them on deployment. Well, you deploy them to a CDN and you're done, right? So everyone gets a 10 there. There's not much work to do. With HTTP2 and gzip, those can be pretty fast. HTTP2 is something to definitely look into because it allows you to not concatenate all your files together. It does multiplexing of streams, so they've seen it's like 2 times faster in HTTP, and the things that we do with minifying everything and concatenating everything doesn't have to be done as much. So I encourage you to look into that if you haven't already. With debugging, Angular allows you to debug from the DOM itself. So with Chrome Developer Tools, you can actually look into the DOM and inspect it. They have this nice log service you can use. Chrome has a debugger command that you can use to get into it. They also have this Angular Batarang. Has anyone used this? It's like a Chrome plugin. A few of you? Did you like it? Yes? Good enough? Watch out. I lost a whole half a day because of that tool, because it was inspecting my Angular code and messing it up. And you know what I did? I spent like half a day, and then I Googled, and boom, first answer. Right? And it was like a bug, and it was like disable Batarang, and then it all works again. So be careful with it. I actually deprecated score on this one because they have that tool. With Ember, by default, they have a log transition. So when you create an app, you can say every time you transition between one state to another, log it and print something out in the console. I think that's pretty nice. They also have a number of other ones that you can hook into. And they have a number of handlebar helpers that help with debugging. You can do logging and debugging like in the page. And they also have this Ember inspector that has 5 stars as far as a rating on Chrome Store. So this is a plugin that you put into Chrome. Batarang 2.5. So, just because there's a tool doesn't mean it's great. React has React Dev Tools. And if you actually use Chrome Developer with React, it'll tell you to go download React Dev Tools. It's like there's something better than what you have right here. It's got pretty diff, React debug, and I give Ember the highest scores here because they have the most things that you can use within your JavaScript or within your pages for doing debugging. And like I said, Angular gets a ding because they have this tool out there that's not that great. So with scaling, scaling so you can have the fastest framework, I think it's interesting to look at TodoMVC's benchmark. This is written by the guys that make the Elm language and its associated framework because they want to basically have an alternative to JavaScript and prove that it's faster. So you can see here that Ember doesn't do so well on its rendering benchmark, and Angular does actually better than React. And a lot of times you hear that React is better, so it's interesting to see that. So based on that, I give Angular a 9. I give Ember a 7 because it was twice as slow, and React a 9 as well. I think Ember is still fast because it's a JS framework, and it's, even though it's slower than others, it is used by Apple on their major new launch of music. So, that was announced this year. It's obviously fast enough. But what about universal or isomorphic JavaScript, stuff that's rendered on the server, right? We're talking about server-side rendering of this JavaScript. React and Ember have this. Angular does not. They're talking about it for Angular 2, so here I kind of give awards out, and Angular gets second place. So now it's called universal JavaScript instead of isomorphic. I just call it server-side rendering. Then everyone knows what you're talking about. Like I said, it's on the list for Angular 2, first place for React. Ember has it now, and they're developing it actively, and Angular, second place. So I'm going to give Angular a -1 on that scaling. And I'll give Ember a +1, and I'm going to give React a +2. But the scorecard doesn't go to 11, so they just get 10 there. So let's look at maintenance. It's JavaScript, so have fun maintaining that. I don't know if you've seen this talk called What, but it shows how there's so much quirks and weird stuff in JavaScript. You create an array with 3 tens in it, and the second one's not a number, and the third one's 2 when you map that and parse them as integers. And all these other things where you're adding arrays and adding objects. So I give Angular a 3. But the reason I give them a 3 versus the others is because of the whole Angular 2 and we're not going to be backwards compatible. Right? They're just like, hey, we're creating a new framework. Have fun, all you 118,000 askers of questions migrating to the new one. They have gotten better though, right? They have said, hey, we're going to create a way for you to run Angular 1 and Angular 2 side by side in the same app. We'll make it so you can write your Angular 1 code and it'll work in an Angular 2 app. I'd say 6 with TypeScript in Angular 2 because that's a little more compiled and a little more easy to know if you mess stuff up. Ember, it's still JavaScript, but you do have the benefit of the community. You know that no big company at any point is going to be like, okay, we're rewriting everything, right? It's still community driven, so there's a lot more feedback there. It's similar to Spring, even though there's been several companies now involved with Spring. They have the best track record for backwards compatibility, except for maybe Java, right? But they're slow because they don't really add any new innovative features, where Spring's done a really good job of being innovative and then maintaining backwards compatibility. React, it's not even 1.0, which means they can break anything they want and be like, hey, we didn't have a 1.0 yet. So I kind of give them a low score there too. JavaScript error monitoring, right? This is part of how you maintain an application. With Java, we have the ability to look at logs, right? We have the ability to have things like, New Relic, right? Monitor everything and give you alerts when things are happening. With JavaScript, there are tools that are similar. There's Track.js and New Relic browser. So New Relic has something similar. These things track JavaScript errors like a border collie tracks a Frisbee, or a ball or anything. Anyone have a border collie? I have 2, and one's like nuts. Like he will play ball all day long and tomorrow without even taking a rest. So when you look at these are interesting. There's also Raygun, there's also Bugsnag, JS Monitor. There's a bunch of others, and I just grabbed the first one. So the first 2, Track.js and New Relic, those were the ads that showed up on Google. So I clicked on them, like 3 times each. It's like they're going to pay for those. But the Google rank on the other ones, on the legitimate results, is Bugsnag, JS Monitor, and Kubaka. The others are all ads. Has anyone used any of these? So I just started using Track.js last week, and I haven't put it into production yet, but it's a great idea in the sense that if there's any errors in the logs, you'll get notified instead of your users being like, I clicked on a button and it didn't work. So obviously this will work with most of them. So let's move on to sharing. This is basically the code, right, and the community, and mailing lists, and commercial support, and who's using it, and jobs, and candidates. So these are the pretty graphs. GitHub activity. Angular has the most contributors. Ember and React, similar. Watchers. Angular has the most. Ember, not so much. React, a lot of watchers. Stars. Angular has twice as many as React. Ember has half as many as React. Forks. Angular's got a ton. So I think watchers are important, right? It's people watching the project and stuff, but forks is like people that said, hey, this is easy enough that I can go and change the code and maybe figure it out for myself. Pull requests, people contributing, whether it's internal to Google or outside of Google. I think that's interesting that Angular still has a ton. So even though it's most popular, it's also got the most activity going on its open source project. Stack Overflow, like I said, tons of questions for the different frameworks, mostly for Angular. Google groups, members, 18,000 for Angular, 2,000 for React. Ember was like, we don't really want to do that anymore, so they closed their Google group. But they have a discuss.ember.js or Ember.js.com, and React has the same thing. So those both projects have moved off of Google groups, and there was no way for me to get information from that tool, the Discuss tool, to see how many members they had. So, they're very interactive. There's a lot of people talking, but there's no reason to count discussions because we have Stack Overflow. npm.js.org has add-ons for the various frameworks. So you can see there's 4,000 for Angular, there's 2,000 for Ember, and 5,000 for React. I don't know if I believe that for React. That's like blown up, right, in 2 years. So those guys have obviously had a lot of people contributing different libraries. Commercial support. No one offers commercial support for these. But I have some business cards. So there's lots of consultants, right, that do it, and there's lots of web developers out there that are learning it and willing to help. Who's using it in production? Well, with Angular, that built with AngularJS.org is a good site, but there's also made with Angular, and I recommend if you're doing Angular, follow them on Twitter for maybe just a couple of days just to be like, wow, that's pretty cool. You learn that a lot of sites are using it. The Weather Channel, Google Trends and Analytics. There's actually, I think, on that site, there's a list of 20 or 30 Google properties that are built with AngularJS. So even though you're trying hard to figure out, what Google uses, there's a number of them that you don't think about that do use it. Amazon uses it. Forbes uses it. MSNBC uses it. So all pretty big names there. Built with Ember.io is another site that shows Ember ones. Apple Music. Ember users has Yahoo on there and Square. So they don't have any big main sites, right, like the others do, but Apple Music is pretty big, and there's some big companies using it as well. Well, with React, they got those guys, and 1 billion people logged into Facebook on August 24th, so I think that means they can scale pretty well. Looking at candidates, on LinkedIn, there's 183,000 people that say they know Angular. So, there's probably some riffraff in there, but there's probably some, pretty smart people too. With Ember, there's only 9,000, in React there's 8, but chances are those people have really dug in and, probably know it pretty well. Jobs, there's 3,000 jobs on LinkedIn for Angular. 1,000 for Ember, and 500 for React. So you can look at that two ways. Well, I can be a consultant and I can go out, there's plenty of jobs, or maybe I'll go for the niche, jack up my rate, and do well with React. Career Builder, not as many jobs, but still, I think it proves that LinkedIn, has some interesting stuff where, Angular does have the most and Ember and React are about the same. If you look at trends on Indeed, you can see that Angular is trending high on jobs versus the other two, and Ember is actually doing better than React. So if you look at all those, those guys are doing great, right? If you compare them to the Java web frameworks, JavaScript web frameworks have way more popularity, way more users. There's a huge audience. There's a lot bigger audience of web developers. So if we look at all those, we get this scorecard, right, with all the different rankings. And if we total them all up, we get Ember as the high one. I was like, what? I'm Angular biased. Isn't that supposed to be higher? And so if you look back, there's certain ways of tweaking it, right? You can look at that one that says maintainability where I gave Angular a 3 and be like, well, let's give that a 5, and then woo, Angular wins, right? And so personally, I was surprised, but it was kind of that maintainability one. There was other ones that you could tweak a number or two, and so I give them first. I give them second. Obviously, I got an error in my slide. That should be an 83 right there, not a 10. And I give React a good job participation sticker. But you probably, shouldn't really take this as, golden advice because, the weights aren't really accurate. You're not going to weight all those different criteria the same. You might care about maintainability more than security or about the ability to test because you're not going to write tests anyway. And so I think, it's important when you take something like this, if you're going to do a scorecard, then add some weights to it and add it up that way so you get, things that are a little more accurate. But everything isn't equal. You got to remember that these are just my opinions. And you know what they say about opinions? It's kind of like that talk show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? This talk has everything in it, and the points are made up, and nothing matters. So that's kind of where we are. These rankings are great, but decide on the strengths and weaknesses of the particular framework and whether it works for you. And then if you want to do a scorecard, you can certainly do it, or just go with your gut. If you've chosen bad web frameworks in the past, maybe don't do that. But if you have colleagues that have, maybe ask them, what do you think is a good one? If, people have chosen, PHP and their frameworks, then maybe don't let them make the choice. But if you chose Spring MVC way back and you're still using it, maybe you'll have, a good knack for knowing what a good JavaScript framework is. So I do want to have a discussion, and I know it's early, and, some of you have fallen asleep, but hopefully you're awake now. We're getting towards the end. When do you think it's a good time to use a particular JavaScript framework? Does anyone have experience where their particular framework worked really well, or when not to use one? Depends on the application, your business use case. Nice generic answer. Well done. So, a Wikipedia, right? Maybe not even a JavaScript or a web framework, right? Maybe more of a Java one, or PHP has obviously worked pretty well. The interesting thing that I've had with a lot of my clients is the really successful ones had the worst frameworks. LinkedIn, Overstock.com. Those guys are doing great, right? But the maintainability of the code and the Java web framework that they used, it was all in-house, proprietary. No one wanted to learn it, difficult to use, but didn't really affect the success of the company. Does anyone else have opinions on whether they used one and it didn't work, or didn't use one and they were happy about it? All right, I tried. I didn't know the talk was going to be early. I was hoping there was beers and stuff like that and everyone was willing to talk.
You can screw up the best framework and you can make the worst framework shine, depending on your team's familiarity with the task at hand, right?
This guy is saying it's all about people. You can make the best framework bad and you can make the worst framework good. So hire smart people, right? Is your advice there? Try to, right? It's hard to hire people because you really don't know if they're good until you worked with them. So better than anything else, hire your friends' coworkers that they've worked with in the past. Don't just hire friends, hire people that people have worked with. And that's why networking and conferences like this are so important, because you'll meet people, and chances are, if they're here, they might know how to code. So we do have 15 minutes left. I'll get to the Q&A in a sec, but I wanted to share this slide with you that just came out yesterday. Such good timing that I'm doing this talk and this comic comes out. Did anyone see this yesterday? So it's called Choosing a JavaScript Web Framework. The challenge when choosing a JS framework is to jump onto the right train at the right moment. If you jump too soon, you don't know where you'll end up. But if you wait too long, you'll get left behind. Hey, wait! How do you know which is the right train? That, my friend, is the real question. So this is a list, right, of trains. There's Vanilla.js, that's always on time. Started in 1995. There's MooTools, canceled, 2006. There's jQuery, still on time. Prototype, canceled, right? So there's all these JavaScript libraries. Pretty funny. Angular 2, meh. Maybe late, maybe not. React has crazy boarding. Ember.js has a new train coming. So it is kind of a battle to try to figure out which web framework should I use with JavaScript. And I think the important thing to watch is the ones that can render server-side, right? So you could pop that first page, and then you still have a JavaScript app after that. Or you can render it quickly if you need to, and scale out that way. So my advice is don't be afraid to try new things. Learn JavaScript if you don't know it. Try one of these frameworks if you haven't. Form your own opinions, or just wait a few months. And then there'll be a new one that you can learn. Questions? We have a mic here so everyone can hear.
If we're using a Java framework like Rails, might it make sense to use a JavaScript framework that did less, so that they weren't trying to do the same thing, that there was a simplicity of approach?
Typically what you do if you're going to use a JavaScript framework to build your UI is whatever Java framework you're using becomes your REST API, right? And there's really not a lot of reason to do those server-side templates as much anymore, especially if you get something like React or Ember where you can do it on the server side. Now, a lot of those do it on the server side with Node, right? So then you're like, how do I get Node into my Java? And there's Nashorn, and there's going to be a ton of talks at Java 1 about how Oracle is promoting JavaScript on the JVM. So I'd watch for that in the next couple weeks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we call jQuery as a framework?
Well, so jQuery isn't a framework. Well, they're all toolkits, right? Unless they're like an MVC framework. And so I think the interesting thing about jQuery and Bootstrap in particular is in Java we were trying to create, or people were trying to create all these components all the time, right? These component-based frameworks, JSF and Tapestry, and they thought that was the holy grail. And there were certainly people that got on board and liked them, but I was always a Spring MVC, struts kind of guy where I like the action-based and request-based, so I never saw the value in those component-based frameworks until like jQuery UI and Bootstrap came out, and I was like, that's the components I want, right? I want the ability to just pop in a few lines of code and get this calendar or whatnot, and so jQuery kind of has that ability, right? And it also took it so we could write JavaScript and not worry about all the different browsers. So it's more of a toolkit than a framework, but people still call it a framework.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
I'm very biased because I'm a Java developer. But from a Java developer point of view, the JavaScript world is very fast-moving. And
Yep.
as you highlighted in your last slide, yeah, it changes every time.
Right.
And I'm using Vardin. I'm using Spring MVC. It's very stable. It's mature. It will be maintained for ages while
Right.
JavaScript gets dropped. There is a new JavaScript framework every 6 months, and it gets hype, and then all the frameworks are forgotten. What's your opinion on that?
I think Java was in the same place in 2004, 2005, right? There was as many frameworks coming out, and there was new things being developed all the time, and it's just we're lucky to have gotten stable. And we're lucky that we have things like Spring that are an alternative to Java EE that have had that same stability. Ember is one of the first ones that have come out with like long-term support. And so I think you'll start to see that from more libraries where they're like, hey, we're not gonna have, something brand new. And these guys have such dominance on the market that they have to do something if they want to maintain that dominance. So if you want to see how much a framework is popular, all you have to do is follow those people on Twitter, like the founders and the promoters and stuff like that. If you want to see that they're not popular, just unfollow them. So if I want a thing that Vaadin is the best Java MVC framework, all I got to do is follow the Vaadin folks. I'll be like, wow, this is really popular, right? And same thing with the JavaScript. If you follow the people that develop the frameworks, you're going to be like, wow, they're talking about it all the time. So you can kind of put your earmuffs on, right, and be like, there is nothing new in JavaScript land, but it can be overwhelming. And so I think that's what motivates talks like this, is kind of saying that, well, what you're using is probably good enough, and do a little bit of research before you just jump on board. But I agree that there is not much stability there, but I think it's coming.
Thanks, Matt. Are you running into customers that say, Angular's our favorite, we love it, but with Angular 2 down the road, we're not willing to invest knowing we're going to have to rewrite this app, so we're going to go with our second favorite choice?
I don't have any clients that have ever told me to choose a particular framework. They basically said, here's the app we want, what do you want to write it in? Right? And so it's kind of unfortunate the client I work for right now is in the fashion industry. That's cool, right? But they don't have any technical founders. A lot of the founders are people that have had fashion businesses, apparel businesses, and sold them and made millions, and so they have a new startup that has a niche. But they could care less about what framework we use.
Well, how about if you were going to invest a significant amount of time in some product, like some app that you were going to write, and say,
right.
Well, that'd be great, but with Angular 2.0, do I want to have to rewrite
Right.
it?
With Angular 2, I think it was just poor communication on their part to be like, we're not backwards compatible, right? It was a kick in the nuts for all the Angular developers to be like, whoa, that stinks, right? It's not backwards compatible. They've since backpedaled, right? And so my big thing right now is I'm writing a book on JHipster, which is Spring Boot and Angular on the front end. And so I have used Angular, and I haven't really had a problem with it, right? I'm a Satisficer, I'm not a maximizer. And so with Angular 2, I think it's going to be good, and I think I'll learn it, but I don't really have to because no one's really hiring me to do it yet. And I think, I'll kind of follow the trends, and I tend to lag a little bit behind instead of being like a front runner, just because a lot of my time is spent actually writing code for clients, and experimenting it's hard to find that time to do it. But I think it'll be legit. I don't know if TypeScript will be something I really glom onto. I am a Java developer. I like static typing, but the whole JavaScript thing doesn't bother me too much. Anyone else? How are we doing on time? 5 minutes left? 7 minutes? All right.
What's your opinion on ext.js?
ext.js?
Yeah.
I don't follow those guys on Twitter, so it doesn't seem that popular anymore. When I used it in the past, we used it at Evite. I think it was 2009, and the biggest problem that we had was its theme. We developed a login page that was like 256K, and we're like, well, the Spring MVC version of that's 12. Why are we downloading 256K just to have a login page, right? So we were using it improperly, and some guy, that weekend was like ripped out. It was GXT, right? We were using that as a bridge to ext.js, and it just added a lot of bloat that we didn't need. But for a nice big application, I think it worked pretty well. I also used GXT at a client later that year. This is 2009, and we developed basically a desktop IDE in a browser. But again, GXT, which is a wrapper around ext.js. So it worked well. I liked it. But 2009, that was 6 years ago. I mean, it's impressive that it's still going, right? And they're still doing well. And Vaadin's doing well with GXT or with GWT as well. But you can kind of see Google's like, that's not really our thing anymore, right? We're kind of backing away from GWT. But again, they have two simultaneous frameworks going. They have AngularJS and they have Polymer and web components, right? And that's where all these frameworks are kind of going, is towards Polymer, where you can have a web component that can be used by any JavaScript framework, right? Instead of having it have to be an Angular directive or a React component that you can just, pull this file in and use it. So that's where everyone's trying to go, and I think, Polymer's got a lot of great stuff out there. But yeah. We'll meet. Woo! That's what happens when you get close, huh?
So in the world of fast UI responsive design, we're moving away from server-side rendering more, that's the whole concept of Angular, and that's why it's so popular, right? Why would you score Ember, and even Angular is now trying to consider, you said, server-side rendering capabilities? Why is that being done?
Because it's faster. So typically, these are rendered client-side, which the big move that's worked out so well is because our client-sides are nice CPUs, right? And our phones have nice CPUs, and so, it works pretty well, but you still get, that page, and they're still spinning and stuff. And even on, you can see Facebook, they've done a pretty good job of having like the article placeholder now, and then it gets populated with something. And so it's still not that pop that you get from server-side rendering. So what they talk about when they're doing that is they're going to render the HTML, and then they're going to give everything to you already rendered. And so it's just that initial experience that's getting better. It's also a little for SEO, but you saw that that's not as important as it once was. So I think the interesting thing is we went all client-side, but then these huge web-scale companies have had a hard time having satisfied users. And so they've gone back to a little bit of server-side, but they've done it in a way where they can still use the same frameworks. So that's why it's kind of neat that you can, have a server process it on that side. It's the initial load, and then, it's basically a static page, but has all the JavaScript in there, and so that's an application after, right? And you know how important it is for just that initial experience to be good. Yeah?
For this comparison, did you build things in React and Ember?
No.
Okay, just researching it.
Yep. Like I said, I've never done React or Ember in production. And, I like to do things in production when I'm paid to do it, so free conference. Anyone else? All right, well, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.